Morning, folks.
Howdy.
Happy Thursday. Looks like a bunch of people are showing up for early on this one. I'd put a bunch of items on the agenda, just not knowing how much we would get through. I'm always happy to reorder if people want to talk about specific topics.
I would love to get opinions on the PR I have, trying to clarify the artifact versus image distinction semantically.
Mm-hmm. Got that one on the list. Should we pull that up earlier?
Yeah, if there's interest. That one is, I think, 11:41 for anybody who's not spotting it right away in the doc.
I'll also include the doc link here for anybody that's not following along that side. Getting a full house today.
I suspect that most people want to talk about a different issue, but if we can knock this one out quick, it's been languishing for a couple weeks, could be nice.
I mean, we've got a bunch of them been languishing for a while, but my suspicion is that everybody is showing up to talk about the issue du jour. I had been putting down the bottom list thinking we wouldn't make any progress on that one, so I figured we would knock some other stuff out. But if we've got people who want to talk about it, I will be more than happy to chat about it. Even got Sajay. I didn't think Sajay was going to make it in this week.
I think we should talk about it.
All right. Well, let's softball it first. Let's do the defining artifacts one in there, 1141, and then we'll jump into the hard one and then see if we have any time left for everything else I put. This is a guaranteed way to make people show up, is that is put all the other stuff I want to talk about, and then I had to put a big note in the agenda that says we didn't get to any of it.
So on 1141, just to summarize it quickly, the idea is to semantically define a artifact and an image, because 999 has caused a lot of confusion on where artifacts removed from the spec. If you know where to look in the disconnected files, but there's not really a summary of what an artifact is or even how to detect them. The config.media type fallback hasn't been kind of enumerated explicitly everywhere. And then also we're, trying to, I guess the distinction I've come up with at this point, I'm not married to the wording, but so far the distinction I've come up with that I really want to shop by people between artifacts and images is that an image is something that is interpreted either according to the process described in conversion.md or a process similar to the one described in conversion.md. I haven't had that similar language because, for example, Podman and Docker don't explicitly follow that process. But it's close enough, it's approximate enough that I'm not sure that we need to make the distinction that it's not fully conformant with conversion.md. So the idea basically being an image is what we have today with the release version of the spec, and it's something that is intended to be interpreted with a conformant config blob according to the process in conversion to then turn into a runtime bundle eventually, and everything else is an artifact. And then there is kind of then the question of like, what if you set the artifact type to the OCI config media type, which we could explicitly address, or we could leave it unsaid. I'd rather just leave that unsaid and up to runtime implementations what they do. But there is sort of an implicit, like, don't do that in here, even if it's not explicitly enumerated, because it's suggested that if you see an artifact type, don't try to process it as an image. If you don't see artifact type, then run it through your code that exists today that interprets it using your image to runtime bundle conversion process. And it looks like I've got a couple suggestions here I still need to get folded in.
I feel like there's two things going on here. One is that a runtime that is looking at a specific image, does it even attempt to run it? And there are cases where people have used the OCI config media type, but then changed the layer. And
sure, those are nonsense images today. Those have never, like, how would I put it? Technically, you can have a conformant image that way because we don't, the possible layer types are unbounded. And if you don't know how to interpret the layer, like, yeah, you're not going to be able to run an image out of it. But in practice, most of those are even more of a nonsense condition in my experience, Brandon, because they tend to have a non-conformant config. Either it's like a skeleton config that doesn't include required keys like rootfs, or it's just some random JSON that doesn't even resemble a real config. At least I don't want to address those here. Like, I don't think we should be concerned with like, here's what you should do with non-conformant content. That will just explode at one part or another of trying to interpret it with existing code, and I think that's fine.
The other side that we're looking at is not that you're looking at a specific image, but you're looking at an index of images. And so all you have is a descriptor. And so you don't even have the individual fields from the image manifest. You're just looking at the descriptor inside of the index.
Right. And that is the specifically the advice on ignoring the contents of the index based on the artifact type. I mean, technically that's, if you look at my little two-step process there, technically that it could be broken out into three, because we first look at the artifact type and the descriptor, or then, we might look into the manifest, but
technically the artifact type, if you have a non-conformant config media type, you're supposed to pull it up in your artifact type field.
yeah, so that's what I mean. If it's conformant, you should just be able to look at the artifact type, but you could potentially look past that. Maybe there should be a 2 with a and a B of just, if you don't want to be super thorough, or if you didn't fetch the content, don't bother looking at the manifest. If you already have the content, it doesn't hurt to look to make sure that somebody didn't forget to populate the artifact type and the descriptor.
I'd say the only thing I'm trying to be careful of, and I left the comment on this one earlier, was that I want to be careful we're not trying to standardize that people push a mixed index. Or if we are going to standardize that, I want to make sure we have buy-in from the runtimes, different people on that side, that if they're going to see an index that has a mixture of runnable images and non-runnable artifacts in the same index, that they're on board with that's what OCI is proposing as a common use case out there.
Yeah. I mean, my idea is still not to formally describe platform selection. It is just to say that if you see something that's not a runnable image and you don't know how to interpret it, you should just pretend it doesn't exist as guidance. The idea here being that this is already something that runtimes have to implement in one way or another, or that tools that build indexes are making an end run around them, typically by setting the platform to unknown, so that they're skipped for platform selection. And, we should instead, unknown is directly in conflict with the spec, since we specify that you should use values known to the Go tool chain. So it's better to specify that, if you want it to be ignored by a runtime, make it an artifact, unless say that you invent some WASM artifact type that containerd knows how to run, but it doesn't use the OCI config JSON blob, uses a different one. Great. Containerd can have special knowledge of how to run that. But, by default, because there's an unlimited number of artifact types that exist, if runtimes are, should ignore them, that solves the unknown problem. And I mean, I guess, if anybody ideally from the cryo side wants to weigh in, if there's anybody here. Like I've run this by people on the container D side, and it's relatively uncontroversial there, even if I didn't get Derek or Brian to comment on this one. I guess Brian, if you know, just to get your gut check, since I don't think I've explicitly talked to you about this one as well.
Might have ambushed him with a unexpected question there.
Yep.
So what Brandon was asking after is, does it feel necessary to add the guidance of during platform selection, or, you know, how would I put it? If you don't know about an artifact that's mixed in an index with images, you should ignore them during platform selection, essentially. So that's one of the things I want to get in here, but that is, you know, maybe a little overly prescriptive to some, potentially.
I'm not going to claim to be a spec writer. I think should is okay. It's kind of, as you said, it kind of already have to do that anyway, or error out, I guess, if they really wanted to, but
Well, and that's the thing too, is like, you know, the error out case is, I don't think really tenable. Like we see mixed image and non-image content in an index today. And, you know, again, today, that's the whole unknown hack in the platform, you know, just put some garbage in there so that it will be skipped.
Yeah, in that case, you just have an unusable runtime.
Well, or, you know, some people argue that BuildKit is defective for doing things that way, but it does. And all runtimes have had to adapt to it because they want to run images built with BuildKit. So not that BuildKit produces artifacts today. Today, BuildKit produces a fake image that has a platform unknown.
You also have a few crazy people that strip those back out again.
I don't think we
All
have
right.
any representation from anybody who's a cryo contributor maintainer here. So that might be as far as we get today.
Might be. Should we go ahead and turn it over for the big question that I think a bunch of people here are showing up for? I guess the big question everybody's waiting on is next steps for how do we handle the manifests that have a non-existent subject and go. Yeah, like everybody wants to talk about it, but nobody wants to actually be the one that's talking about it. Jesse, go ahead.
Yeah, I've been reading the maintainers thread. I'm not a maintainer, but I've been reading along. And I feel like we've had like a couple of conversations where we highlight a good use case. I think it's a use case that we had in the working group that we defined and all agreed to. And that is not so much the timing of signature push and you know, the broadcasting of an image that's ready for use, but more the signatures in a different repo. I think it's a more clear-cut use case that we could focus on, and it's the one that we discussed, right? Even a different registry, even, right? Like storing referring artifacts elsewhere, I think was a use case we all agreed to. So I think that's sort of one thing that we should really speak to. If we're going to relitigate things, I think we should relitigate the desire to meet that use case. I think that that's one part of what's hanging us up. The other part is that there seems to be two arguments against the must language, which makes that use case possible, right? And correct me if I'm wrong, we put the must in there to meet the needs of that use case. And you know, so that GC, or like, you know, as Bjorn and I have discussed, like registries like ECR and Docker Hub don't come along and delete, you know, what appear to be orphaned referrers, right? So we have a must in there. We must accept to meet that use case. The arguments against that seem to be two things. One is that it is not backwards compatible, or it's a breaking change. And I think that is not so much around the unknown field, but more the, you know, sort of the DAG argument, which is the second thing, which is to say that we have a field whose value is a digest, therefore it is part of the DAG and needs to be a sort of verifiable in that way. And I think that we had discussed now twice that a lot of us don't see it that way, and conceptually it doesn't necessarily really make sense. But in that maintainers thread, like I think Steve-O had mentioned it, and I don't know, is Derek here? So neither Steve or Derek are here, right? Bummer. Okay, well, so that
Neither
they're
of them.
both saying,
Mike is here though.
oh, hi, Mike. Yeah, you did a lot of agreeing with them, so maybe you can proxy for them. So the problem that I have with that is that it's a little nonsensical to consider refer as part of the image content. I don't mean that derogatorily. I just mean like it doesn't work in my brain, right? And I think getting back to use case, that's the problem of saying, oh, well, I've signed in the image, so I've got to sign it, push the signature, then the image. No, I've got an image and I want to create an SBOM for it a week later. Right, that's a completely valid use case. Or I want to sign my image every 24 hours. I'm going to expire my signature and I'm going to sign it every 24 hours. Image is there, N days old, new signature every day. It's not part of the image content. The refer is just that. If it was part of the image content, we would have framed the entire working group solution differently. But it isn't. Conceptually, it's its own artifact with its own DAG. And there is, you know, I mean, I get, yes, you may have the digest and want to verify that it's valid content. Didn't the registry already do that? Don't we do that when you push content? Right, so that's the other argument I just don't really understand. So I'd like to just hit them, basically, to Derek's advice, stick to the solution, stick to what we're talking about. The use case and the proposed problems with the spec change, I think, are what, you know, where my head's at, and it's still not making sense.
I'll say one reason the DAG feels confusing to me as well is that when I think about how clients are walking this, how do clients get the digest of the signature manifest? It's not an element inside of the image that was signed.
Correct.
They're not walking the DAG from the image there, but they're also not going and immediately pulling the signature and then walking that to find the image. They're calling the API and the API is giving it to them. And the API, how they get the API, they have the digest of the image to call that. And so the logical ordering of how they get to that content is not the same ordering of everything else in the DAG that we've described so far, of where they have the image manifest that has a bunch of layers to find in it. To get that digest of the signature, they are saying, here's the digest of my image. Tell me where all the signature content is. And the registry says, it's over here. And so the path that clients walk to get to it follows much more of a concept that is not apparent. It is a, you know, it's treated as an attached child of some kind. Jeff, go ahead.
Yeah, so honestly, I've been having conversations with you, just trying to dig into it a bit more. And I think over time, maybe the DAG aspect is becoming less important to me. I think some of the other, there's some other maybe edge cases in there that are starting to worry me a bit more than that one. I think the DAG one is interesting because it's sort of a case where, historically speaking, we've been able to get away with not talking about GC. And I think we talked about this a little bit. Like GC has very much been an implementation thing. Registries can kind of do it. But if you're assuming a DAG model, the rules around that somewhat make sense. When it comes to refers, though, it sort of breaks those conventions and start getting into the state where without having defined GC rules or any expectations around that, you can get yourself into a lot of weird edge cases. Because the way this is sort of written up is, if the subject exists, then you're sort of creating this reverse link. And so, okay, we don't really want to clean it up because it's pointing to something. But in the case where the subject does not exist, well, we still don't really want it to clean up. And so in that case, we have to sort of create a tag to it in order to create a reference there. And so you get into this weird place of, well, if when you're pushing artifacts that the subject doesn't exist, you have to know that you need to also upload a tag in order to kind of pin it to keep it around. Otherwise, it's sort of in this weird state where it's a untagged orphan digest floating around that could be subject to deletion. It may not, it might, depending on the rules of the registry. That's sort of a weird case of, well, maybe we can clarify it of if you're uploading something that's with an orphaned or with a subject that doesn't exist, you'd have to tag it. And again, that's sort of implementation details in GC. I mean, I say, yes, I agree that GC is not part of the spec, but we've been able to ignore it because there have been hard rules in place around kind of a DAG. This breaks that. And so with the different use cases. And then secondarily, getting into the only way to actually remove artifacts would be by doing a delete manifest by digest. And when delete manifest by digest is not broadly supported by all registries, that sort of means that artifacts become append only in this implementation, which is also maybe workable, but something to call out. And so I think there's a few use cases there where maybe it's not a direct DAG, but in some cases we want there to be a link, but then we also don't want to honor the link in all cases, and it just creates a somewhat awkward middle ground.
I think we yeah, Jeff, thank you. That voice is part of the concern that we've been hearing around like race conditions, I think, fair to say. And I haven't really followed that either, because I mean, we have a lot of customers in ECR that don't use tags. I don't think that there's anything that indicates if you have untagged content, it should be GC'd, right? Or that it's not in use or not valid. So I think the argument the concern kind of falls apart a little bit for me there, which, might just be a bias of saying, well, we don't have that problem. But I mean, I think and other registry implementers here might have other things to say too. Like maybe there's a third point of view, but I don't know that I don't know that I trip up that much on that concern. Oh, I think we all charge by the GB, right? Fractions of pennies. It's all good.
It depends on your registry. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say it's not a concern if you're charging people by gigabyte, but if you're giving away free storage, it becomes a concern pretty quickly.
I mean,
I think that
I'm not arguing against that. It's not specified, I think, is my point. And we do veer into this quite a lot, where it's like it's a specification, it must have an implementation to make sense of it, but it's also just a specification, and we should be putting into the specification how we believe the software should behave. I don't think there's any registry other than like maybe Zot that's 100% spec compliant. Just for the record, like we all make implementation decisions. So I think I'm just speaking more in terms of the specification. I'm not tripping up on it as a risk. Yes, maybe it has other implications. Completely valid.
So I want to pull in Toddy and Josh and probably a few other people in there and in this side of it. From the cosign notation, see Toddy already commented a little bit there, but if you're pushing your signature to a different repo than wherever the signed content is, and so you're saying cosign my signed content is being stored in this whole different repo over here, would you be comfortable saying that you need to tag that when you push it to that other repo, or do you want the registry to keep that around indefinitely without a tag and without the reference image? Oh, we even got Saja here. don't all jump at once.
What would that tag look like?
Completely up to you to decide. It's your own repo for your own content that you're storing.
It sounds not great. It sounds like it would result in a bunch of garbage tags again.
How would a registry know when it's safe to clean up an untagged
Yeah.
signature that there is no image that is referencing in the same repo?
We are looking at other rules than not just the tag, because we have cases where you have like somebody referencing by digest for whatever reason, and they want to keep that for longer. Even now in ACR, we have a functionality to clean up untagged manifests, but I was just talking yesterday with somebody who said like, well, I don't want this deleted without the kind of my knowledge, right? So, and we were trying to figure out what will be the best ways to really do the garbage collection, and even like customer defined purging of images or any kind of artifact. So right now, I don't think that tagging something is like I'm not sure about the scenario and how that will be accepted by customers. So, but certainly can say that there are scenarios where things are untagged and they can stay in the registry for longer.
I mean, wonder if that could be a user configuration that the user says, I'm pushing this to this repo. Can you please give me a tag for this signature? And the default case would not do that.
No.
Bjorn, go ahead.
Yeah. So just to address Brian's sidebar there, I mean, I think that is the whole topic right here, is kind of related to life cycles, GC or not. Like it is fundamentally that with a soft link, we can't distinguish between the case of it's an invalid digest that will never exist, it is content that has yet to be pushed, or it's content that's been deleted. Those are three possible cases that could result in a dangling, quote unquote, dangling link, and we can't distinguish between them at all. So that's Jeff's whole, question of, does this effectively become append only, where you just push content to the registry, it lingers there forever without anything pointing to it, and then, it's you could say, yes, the user can go through and manually clean those out, but it's expensive to enumerate content and discover content in the registry. Like content discovery is potentially a lot of API calls. So, and then you have to actually get those manifests to even see what's in them, and whether, it's hard to even write your own tooling necessarily, at least in a universal way that'll work against any registry to clean up anything stale. So, it may not actually be append only, even, if we say that, like, ignoring the manifest delete not being universally supported, but it might be functionally so, because it's hard to even, write tooling that will efficiently clean things up.
Oh, my hand. Okay. So I think this gets back to my first call out. We appear to be informally relitigating the acceptance of the use case. So I wonder if, and I'm not proposing this, I'm just trying to walk through this a piece at a time so we don't keep kicking this can down the road. Maybe that's the right thing to do, is for us to discuss the use case of, storing referring artifacts in different repos and different registries. And I don't even understand how the different registry use case is solved for. But in ECR, repository is the tenancy boundary. So that's been the use case that we've been using that's tangible, is to say, I want to put my signatures in this repo, have my images in this other repo, right? So effectively, that'll be like you're pushing a signature where the artifact refer digest just doesn't exist in that repo. Should we talk about that? because I think it seems to be where we're kind of circling back to, is saying like, is this use case valid? Do we need to go around this? Is it fair? For example, is it fair for free to use registries or registries that don't charge storage to accept what would be potentially garbage content? Right? Like if we take must, then that means I can just fire a whole bunch of useless artifacts at some free to use registry and bury them. I don't love that. Like, I just want to be clear. Like, I don't, I think that I'm just trying to walk through this a piece at a time and going back to the first step. This comes back to the use case. Do we think it's a valid use case still?
I think it's a
And I
valid-
guess,
Sorry, I didn't know you.
okay, I'll go. I just wanted to slightly clarify what Jesse's saying, because I agree there, but I just want to also again remind that it's not winners versus losers, it's must versus should. So when we're having this discussion about the importance of the use case, what we're discussing is, must everybody support it, or must only registries who want to make that design and implementation decision support it? And then there's the sidebar about client fragmentation. I don't want to get it too hung up on that, because I think in practice what will happen is if some registries are willfully, knowingly out of spec, then clients are just going to have to deal with it one way or another, whether that's in code or whether that's with upset, frustrated users. But I do want to focus on that uniformity versus diversity, I guess, in registry implementation.
So I think the part I wanted to mention here is that I believe everybody that wanted to pull the must out, it was just for that, right? It was just because they didn't want to force all registries to have to support unvalidated content, okay? Which is currently still in the specification, right? We haven't removed that validation requirement even for artifact subject descriptors. So we still have more work to do if we're really going to make this a must, I believe. Okay, correct me if I'm wrong, Brandon. I think that how we do the validation can be discussed, right? And whether or not that validation is needs to be an absolute requirement still for all the registries. I think that is still open for discussion. But yeah, I mean, a subject descriptor currently states that it must be validated, right? And if it's not local, how is it going to validate that digest, right? One proposal that we've made, right, is that certain registries would be able to add an index or add content to the index, such that if you're going to sign an image, you could put the signature in an index that's in the platform index, for example, right? So you wouldn't be able to sign necessarily the platform index, but you could sign all the rest of the content, okay, with artifacts that you could push to that registry. It would be in the DAG, okay, of the platform index. It would be validatable. You just have to order your sequence of the pushes of the artifacts that you wanted to store in that platform index, and then everything should be fine, right? Again, I think we could probably have an API for doing or disabling validation if the registry in question, says, hey, we can't validate this. At least then we could go back to the image spec and say, unless reported that it's not validated, right? And down. Go ahead, Brandon.
Sounds like we're going back to, I was pointing while you're saying that, the proposal left from the working group, which it's been a long time since we had the working group running, but we had evaluated that proposal and kind of went a different direction from that one back at that point. The other comment I want to make is that the spec says that registries may validate the descriptors, doesn't say they must. And so registries may do that.
Must, you require that you can't validate.
So where I'm going with this is that registries may validate content, which means that you can choose if you want to push the layers and the config blob before your image. But in practice, there are enough registries out there that do validate that content that every client is pretty much forced to push layers first. There are no clients out there that go the other direction. And so us changing this from should to must or must to should, it effectively turns it into every client is going to change their behavior to be able to work with what's going on out there. Jesse.
And I read it as must not validate. Is that what you're saying?
Right now, what we're saying is registries must not validate that one field. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I think it feels like we dove away from the use case a little bit and talked about how it, parts of it might be implemented in one particular opinionated stack, which there's nothing wrong with, but I kind of want to come back to the question. I feel like this is not an implementer registry question. I think this is a client question. This feels to me like a client use case. And honestly, we brought it up in the thread, right? Using cosign as an example. Cosign has a feature by which you can store your signatures elsewhere, right? That seems to be what the use case that we discussed in working group and agreed to is for. And it seems to be the reason we put must in. So I just feel like we maybe need to revisit that, because it's like, I've said it before, and I think Bjorn, you used ECR as an example here. Like, and Michael, correct me if I'm speaking out of turn here. I don't think we really care implementation wise. I think we have opinions, but I think we can make anything work on the registry as far as must or should. We have opinions about what we think it should be, but we can make it work. As it exists, that client that is leaning on that use case cannot make it work if we don't say must. They're going to have probing code that tries something and it maybe fails, and then they have to have, like, for this registry do this, for that registry do that, right? So I think that that's the concern that I want to kind of zoom in on.
Yeah, there was a question in that thread too from Derek of, why can't the client do these gymnastics? And I think certainly, like, you could try any number of requests and try to get your content up. I think that the hope is that you could use the fact that it's a 1.1 or not as the way to make that decision, instead of trying to throw a bunch of requests and have failures and then try some other method. And we have a way, like, there's the head, right? That if you make a head request against refers, that is how we are trying to determine right now, as it stands in the spec, that this is a registry that supports all of the things that came in image spec and distribution spec 1.1. So now we cannot use that as a way to make that decision right at the beginning of the process.
Yeah, we see that from client or end users coming to us all the time in OCI of saying, hey, I read the spec. What's actually guaranteed to work out of all this stuff? Because the spec says there are a whole lot of behaviors out there, but then when I actually try this against the registries, half the registries do this, half the registries do that. What's the actual behavior that I can trust and depend on? And I see that's the value that OCI provides in this.
I said it in the chat, but I just want to also mention again, the whole image is not distribution 1.1. There is a commitment, at least that I personally question the value of, but I mean, hey, it's not a huge deal to release them together. But you can implement one and not the other, or the other way around. And, that's even been posited as a solution, is like, why don't Hub and ECR just, for argument's sake, not implement 1.1? If they don't like the data model of distribution, they implement support for images, they implement refer support, quote unquote implement, but it's available via the refer fallback mechanism generated by client-side tools if needed. And then, you have no problems, was one argument, or the other way is just for the sake of, like, even feature detection, right? Like, you can't, just because a registry supports distribution 1.1 doesn't necessarily guarantee it supports image 1.1, even if it's a little bit of a nonsense configuration to not. They're not intrinsically linked. I mean, I think it looks like you say you support refers, but you don't actually populate the refers API, which by the spec language you could do.
how would it do that in practice? Because what you're saying is I'm going to give you a response to any manifest that has the subject field populated, and then you don't have the processing for the subject field, so you don't know how to give any responses to that.
I mean, I'm saying that I could come up with something that's conformant to the language of one without the other. It's kind of a nonsense configuration because, you know, when you do discovery, you claim support for refers, and then you don't 404 on the refers endpoints. But I mean, you don't provide any content either because you're not parsing the image 1.1 fields, the subject.
Just
Is that
one.
useful? No, but I'm just saying that like they're not intrinsically linked, even if again it's not useful at all in the real world. It's the other
Bjorn,
direction that's more interesting.
Is it fair to say, Bjorn, that you're academically correct, but no one should do that?
I mean,
Like,
yes.
Yeah, okay. I
It's
just want to make
it's
sure
just
that we're
a-
on the
it-
same basis. I don't know where you're going, but I can answer the question about like why don't we just do 1.0, right? Because it's gross. That's why. Because we already have this problem of cosine signatures, which I will just say I'm not calling the project out. It's a great project, but it already lies to us, right? So we already have to poke layer descriptors to see whether or not something's an image or not. Well, okay, fine. Right now we have literally tens of thousands of artifacts coming into our registry that are using a manifest list, and none of the clients know what the heck to do to manage their stuff. Most of them don't manage stuff. They create content, but they don't delete it. Right. So now we've got signatures on signatures and images deleted, and they get burned out. And like, so you got to go use like a client like ORAS. Like ORAS, just you have to go in and manually manage your refers. It's terrible. Right. And that's the problem with fallback. And we said, well, we could do this, but we're opening a can of worms here. We never should have done it, probably. Right. We probably should have said, no, 1.1 is reference types. Let's keep our eye on the ball. If anything, we enabled ourselves to kick this can down the road and not release 1.1. It is gross. I don't know. I'm sure ACR has some things to say. Toddy, Sajay, it's, I don't know if other registries are implementing it, but I know it's there for both of us. And for our customers in ECR, it's not cool. It's not a good experience. So that's the reason we don't want to just implement 1.0, for the record.
I mean, are we talking about like the cosine tag schema? Because like in a registry that implements image 1.1, so you have artifact support, but doesn't implement distribution 1.1, so you don't have the refers API. Like that solves there are lots of things that aren't images in my registry problem, but it doesn't solve the generic mechanism for discovering related content like the cosine tag schema, of course.
Right. I mean, I guess what I'm saying is without 1.1 image and distribution, there are no reference types as a cohesive solution. And that's a terrible world to live in. I don't want to live in it for much longer. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. We have other hands.
I can't see the order. Was there anyone before?
Go ahead.
Josh.
So I think I'm not going to touch upon the technical aspect, but I think I'm going to probably piggyback on what Jesse was saying. There's a huge problem in how the group is functioning. And it is sad because we've been sitting on this problem for years now. And it's not just about a signature at this point. It's basically this spec is been lingering. We have been implementing, clients have been implementing. There needs to be a compromise in some form. And I'm not saying which way, but the problem is that if we are not able to get a 1.1, the entire group is probably in question as to how functional it is. And we went through this with 999. Now we are coming back to this. I think the maintainers for distribution really need to put their heads together and come down to a compromise at some point and make progress. Otherwise, it's really heartbreaking at this point. And I think I'm going to leave it at that.
I almost don't want to say my part +1 to that. I'm personally coming off of being off for a few months for having a baby. And so like I came back and assumed that the release would be cut, and now it's like we're in another existential crisis, and it's really disappointing. And I like all the people involved, and I had time to talk with them personally last week at KubeCon. But it's just like, yeah, it's just completely dysfunctional here. This is something that has been committed in Git history in March of 22. Like people like Derek's name is on this repo, and it's been brought through the stages, and now it's seemingly in the final hour. Like I almost feel we need to have a cutoff of opinions, and I think 999 falls into that category too. There's just a series of things that seem like final hour additions. But I actually did have a suggestion, and I brought this up to a few people. I'm not sure if it actually fixes anything, but is there some way we could resolve this by adding a Boolean of some sort inside of subject that specifies it as not in the DAG? Does that actually solve anything? Does that move the question to that field of a registry needs to support that? I don't know if anyone has any ideas on that. That was like my one thought in looking at all the solutions.
So you're talking about forcing a different storage, an index, if you will, for the artifacts that are not in the DAG, a different.
No, just like, so you have subject digest, right? What I think we're talking about is that digest needs to be in the registry, or certain implementations believe that digest must be in the registry, or else I want to reject that. Can we add a Boolean that sits right next to digest that says like must push true, or something that indicates
Force push? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like then you would have registries that don't implement that, but does that make any sense? Does it help anything?
Jesse, you have a comment on that, or do you have a different comment?
I guess I have a quick comment. I think that, yeah, I mean, I started talking muted, sorry. I think I have a quick comment, and like Josh, I think that is a good compromise sort of move if we agree there's a single DAG here. I just don't get it. Like, I don't want clients walking backwards from a referrer up through, it just doesn't make sense to me. You know, referrers come and go. They are not on the same life cycle. They are not in the same persistent store necessarily, right? I don't buy that part of the argument. If we all come together and we decide that we do buy it, I will commit to that. I will disagree and I will commit. That's an AWS thing, right? I think I've read that somewhere. I will do that. But I need to know that we all mostly agree on that, so that then I can be like, okay, I'll stop arguing. Because and Josh, I appreciate you trying to find like this compromise language. I just don't find it necessary. I don't think we should have to do that.
Yeah, to answer your question, Josh, thinking through that scenario, is there any reason a client would not set that field when they're pushing content?
Right. Yeah.
And I guess
that
maybe
was a
as
very good question, Brandon.
And I guess just as a reminder, like at least where I'm at, like I think Derek feels more strongly about this than me as a author of major definitive implementation, as well as part of the spec language and a longtime maintainer. But like at least for me, and I think this probably goes for Jeff as well now, I'm going to argue from my technical perspective what might make sense to me. But the entire reason I surfaced this to Derek and then Derek opened the issue, at least in my mind, is really because we wanted to be eyes wide open. We want to understand what the pros and cons, what's going to frustrate client authors, what's going to frustrate registry implementers. if ultimately we decide to go the direction that I think technically is not as sound and, you know, leads to like these life cycle GC problems, ambiguity in what the reference means, I think life will go on. There's going to be things that people will be frustrated by or confused by, you know, either way. I personally think that it's less friendly to clients because if registry behavior in real life, at least in the short, medium term, differs from the spec language, I mean, which it often does, but knowingly adding more of that, personally not a fan. But like life will go on and I'll live with the consequences. I think we all will. So, you know, it's the like arguing against the must language, at least for me, isn't saying that like it's utterly unacceptable for it to be there and like this will completely break me and, you know, I can't live with this, but it is that I think there are strong reasons to not do this, but if we all decide to live with the consequences, you know, so be it.
So this might be a question for Mike because Derek and Steve aren't here to answer this one. But from the people in the maintainer vote right now that have said that, yes, this is a breaking change and your vote is that you put that out there. When that vote completes, we're not the 2/3 right now. We don't have enough people saying no that could move the spec forward against the wishes of those that are saying yes. So would that yes vote change if there were enough no votes, beyond half to say, okay, we don't agree, but we want to move the spec forward, or are we going to say, no, we're not going to move the spec
I
forward?
think it's gotten too emotional almost for some of the people that it feels emotional. It feels like we're trying to punt the ball into, you know, some other year. Everybody wants to get this done. Right. I think Derek's working on something that hopefully will make everybody happy. No, that's not going to happen. Right. If the must language was focused on the client, I think that resolves some of your issues, Brandon. Right now, it applies to the client and the server, but it's mostly targeted to the server. Must accept. The must accept language is a little confusing. We allow garbage collection on these things, but now we're not going to allow. So you can push anything you want as an artifact, as large as you want it to be within some reasonable minimums, and then you can never garbage collect it. Of course you can garbage collect, right? So what does must accept mean? What does it mean?
So let me propose different language.
Be able to validate? Some of these things just don't make sense. If we had a little more clarification that maybe it's just, you know, must language on the client, or the client must use the, you know.
So let me propose different language real quick here and see how this flows. If we said that a client may push content where the subject doesn't exist yet to a registry, you know, may, not must, but may.
You've got my vote. Yes.
Would registries reading that language, would they implement it, assuming that there are going to be some clients doing this, and so they need to make sure to support those clients?
Again, what does accept mean? We haven't defined that. Without validation, what does it really mean? I believe the way I'm reading it is it means may accept without validation and store for some reasonable time period before garbage collection, and do an asynchronous validation of the content existing somehow, right? Which would, I assume, have to be provided by an additional client API yet to be discussed, or is it a server API? I think there's a hole in the use case, both in the image spec, in the description of the descriptor, and in the language that we have around being able to remove content, right? And what does it mean to accept? I think if you focus on the client side, clients must be able to support both types of registries, both ones that will store permanently artifacts that have a digest, right, reference that's not stored locally, and validated that it's not stored locally. But then what does the client look like when he goes to get this content, right? Does he have a config where he knows the certain types of artifacts are stored in one place and the images in the other? Yeah, probably, right? That's how I would do it. That's how it's done today. We go to SigStore to get a certain type of artifact, and we go to another image registry to get a 1.0 image. I think that's still a valid use case. And I believe, if I'm not wrong, the OCI is all about not breaking the prior API. We, at least right now, we probably have to make a change with top support to introduce, and that's why I think it's a breaking change, right? The must language makes it a breaking change, in my opinion. I'm done.
If no one else has something to add, Jeff, you made a comment like at the beginning of the call about tags fixing part of this. I kind of want to clarify what that means and maybe pull at that string a little bit more. I don't understand actually how that solves the content not being there. And so I just want to like fully understand and see if there's like a way to explore that.
I'm not necessarily saying it fixes anything. I was more going at it from the perspective of trying to rectify the DAG, because I think a lot of the issues with the DAG was sort of establishing there being a tight connection between sort of the referrer to the subject. In cases of these things are linked together, and so now if I delete the subject, I need to delete the referrers, kind of a thing. The issue of the tag was more, well, if we don't actually want that to be a hard link, if we say it's not part of the DAG, this is just sort of another object that points to it. I'm just saying the way the rest of the registry is defined is sort of a lot of very hard links. You have layers that point to digest, that point to blobs, that point. I mean, everything is very well defined in that space. If we say that the link between the subject or the artifact and the subject is not like a hard part of a graph, but it's just sort of this soft thing, then when it comes to something like garbage collection, and yes, I understand garbage collection is not part of the spec, but like reality is that, you know, these things can happen and the implementation can differ between registries, without there being something like a tag to say, yes, this is in use and needs to stay, then the artifact is sort of technically this untagged floating digest that's not tied to anything hard. And so it could be subject to being removed, or may or may not be there, or could be anything. And yes, I understand that is a registry specific thing, but when we're trying to say we want there to be consistent behavior for these things, that at least is a way to tie it back into previous behavior, where if something is tagged and more permanent, it sort of nails down the existence a bit more. So, and then I guess to get back to maybe like the must versus should thing, like I'm not, I guess maybe I'm probably more with Bjorn, like I'm not necessarily dagger on the DAG, like I'm not, I don't know that it necessarily is. I guess my fear is much more on by having the must in there, it kind of implies that there's not really the ability to do any rejection, any validation, anything. Which sort of ties the hands a bit more on the registry side. And so kind of curious on that, and whether the use cases that it should instead of a must, the use cases that breaks is worth the trade-off of not having that capability at all for the broader audience.
I don't have an answer to that one. Go ahead, Josh.
No, I just like in the cross registry, like cross endpoint scenario, me tagging something over here, like the registry that's validating that subject doesn't, in probably 99.99% of the cases, have authorization to even like access the other registry, right? So that's I think where I was confused, but I understand.
I'll pull in kind of a private comment that I made to Jeff earlier, which was that when you have tag-based garbage collection, you need something to keep that manifest pinned to a tag somehow. And It can be, when you push a manifest, it's either tagged directly. It might have a subject that exists that's tagged. It might be part of an index and the index is tagged. And so there is some linkage to a tag somehow that would have to exist. That's if you do tag-based garbage collection. The other reason I had my hand raised, and we're coming to the end of the hour here, was next week is Thanksgiving. So just a bit of administrative. I think we're going to skip next meeting. Jesse, I might cut you off there.
I was going to eat 2.5 pounds of turkey and jump on this call, Brandon. So you've really ruined. I guess I'll watch football. All right, fine. I'll watch football.
And now I have a big chunk.
There's not enough people laughing. There's not enough people laughing.
I'm laughing. I'm laughing for you.
No,
now
I'm
I just have
getting
a
hungry.
Elias,
I will think of you during Thanksgiving dinner.
I feel like
That's
we made
OCI
some
coming.
progress here. I know we didn't make a decision, but I think we made some progress. So I appreciate everybody. That's all.
We will all be very thankful next week for OCI.
There's been some interesting things in the chat, so maybe someone write that down somewhere beyond that.
I'm going to grab the recording after this. I will pull those out and drop those
Okay.
into the HackMD.
Cool.
Thank you, Brandon.
but
Happy Turkey Day, everybody.
You too.